Okay, Sarah, is it okay if we get started?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I know some of you guys are still coming in, but before we get started, I just wanted to give a super quick tutorial on how to use Zoom. That way you guys can ask questions if you need to. If you go to your toolbar at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen, there will be a chat button. If you click that, you'll have the capability to raise your hand or direct a question to the whole group or to someone specifically. For this particular presentation, if everyone could please private message me their questions. My name is under the Boca Chamber name, and I will ask Thomas the questions as we go through the presentation, and then we'll do an open Q&A at the end as well. So if Sarah, if you would please introduce Thomas.
Absolutely. First, welcome everyone. Hope you're getting the hang of this Zoom thing. I know I am after the last couple of days. We learned yesterday from a presentation from Alex Oliveira, all the do's and don'ts of Zooming. So I'm hoping most of us are not in our pajamas and, you know, all of the etiquette. I guess it's all new stuff. So, all right. So it is my pleasure to introduce Thomas. To me, he's Tommy. I've known him for quite a while, and he's a very active member in our community. We get to sit at a lot of the city council meetings together. He's very involved with the city, and we're very lucky to have him in our community. But to all of you, he's Thomas, very professional, Thomas Zeichman. He's a partner at Marshall Grant who focuses his practice on the representation of debtors, creditors, and trustees in the various aspects of bankruptcy. In restructuring and other bankruptcy matters, Thomas has experience representing purchasers and sellers of distressed assets through bankruptcy, receiverships, and assignments for the benefit of creditors. Additionally, Thomas has represented creditors and bankruptcy trustees pursuing assets of debtors. This experience is valuable when Thomas advises debtors on how to defend against creditor attacks. Thomas is rated AV preeminent by Martindale-Hubbell and has been recognized by Florida super lawyers as a rising star in bankruptcy. He's a Palm Beach County native, resides in Boca Raton, and is in his spare time, he's active in the community through his involvement serving on the Planning and Zoning Board for the city and a vice chair for Florida Atlantic University Alumni Association, as well as serves on the Pulse Committee for the Boca Chamber. So without further ado, Mr. Thomas Zeichman, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the Chamber for giving me this opportunity to present some information. I'd also like to thank Alex for providing a webinar how-to yesterday, because I'll be honest, prior to his webinar, I had not watched a webinar. So it was very helpful to learn how to present one. I think this is going to be a long-lasting method of communication. People are used to watching content on Netflix and everything else, and people are constantly searching for different education opportunities. And I think a webinar seems to really meet that. So again, I appreciate it, and I'll apologize because my presentation won't be as aesthetically pleasing as Alex. Art was never my strong suit. So we'll go ahead and start flipping through the presentation. For some of you, I'll go ahead and say this is probably going to be the high point of the presentation because this is my daughter running at Red Reef Park. When you're when you're young, you kind of know your path is pretty set for you. And when you're in business, when the economy is doing well, you kind of have some level of predictability. You understand your industry well. That's why you got into it. You have a pretty good idea of, if I do this, my customers are going to respond in this manner. If I do this, my vendors are going to react in this manner. And you have, a lot of guidance going forward. And you may even have a business plan. It's probably a document you haven't reviewed in a while, because ordinarily the only time you break it out is when you have your loan applications, you're going in for investor funding or something like that, or you're really just trying to do that effort to sit down, focus on your business, and decide, what new industry or what new market you want to break into, and that's when you may do planning. But when you're in ordinary operations, you don't have much time for planning. You're dealing with the day-to-day. You're receiving phone calls. You're probably not taking time to watch a webinar because you're just trying to deal with everyday life. But sometimes that plan gets interrupted, and this is one of my, I think one of the better things that Mike Tyson has ever said, that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And it's true. You can go in with a game plan, and then as soon, all of a sudden, some unexpected event happens, and that's kind of what we're dealing with. That's what we're dealing with here. None of us expected a virus to come on the scene as it has. We definitely haven't expected the reach of it. You didn't anticipate a global impact, and I'm not sure that anyone expected the government reaction. And it's varied state to state, it's varied federal, it's better at the municipal level. I think it would have been a very rare person to predict a year ago that we would have stay-in-place orders in large states such as New York and California. It would be unlikely that anyone would have predicted any sort of mass closure or real wind down and real limited business in terms of restaurants. And we're kind of seeing the breadth of what happens when you interrupt one part of our economy. Let's use sports, for example. They were pretty early to start suspending games. And then from there it flows to, well, that obviously affects the teams, it affects their staff. And then from there it affects the venue. Some teams own their venues, some are owned by landlords. There's the loss of revenue component there. And then you have the vendors, the food, paper vendors. Imagine you provide programs for a sports team. All of a sudden, that was probably a decent account for you that all of a sudden is interrupted by not having those nightly games. And then the merchandise purchases. And then you expand it out a little bit further. You have, not that you typically hear people cry for Ticketmaster or StubHub, but those businesses are also experiencing a drastic reduction in transactions, and that's going to continue to have an impact going further. And then we have the neighborhoods who are accustomed to sports fans coming down. They eat outside the venue. They buy items outside the venue. That's what we're seeing, is expanding outward. So what I'd like people to consider now is you have this rare opportunity where many of us are working from home. We're not in the office, and we're not experiencing some of the usual interruptions that we have throughout our day. For instance, hey, what are we going to have for lunch? There's the routine things that interrupt your thought process as you're really mapping things out. And again, you're probably looking at the presentation slide right now, and you're saying, Thomas, you're right. You're not very good at making things look aesthetically pleasing. But these are going to be some of the topics that we're going to review as we go along. There's a lot of discussion as far as health right now, and I'm not a doctor, as much as my mom tried to make that happen, and will it. But I do recognize that businesses, they have vitals. There's documents that you're going to review. We're going to discuss some level of insurance. We're going to discuss creditors, funding sources available, employees, accounts receivable, as well as reorganization, which is kind of a broad term that has to do with how people manage a wide array of their debt obligations. Again, as Sophia mentioned, there will be a question and answer component at the end. But I'm used to judges asking me questions when they think it's appropriate. So if you have a question as we're going along, go ahead and put it out there. I would offer one caveat. Please try to be general in your question. And there's not an attorney-client privilege here in this webinar, as well as I don't want to give specific. I'm not going to give specific advice or guidance to you because there's a larger picture that's not always captured in a quick question. But I do invite questions as we're going along, and don't expect you to just hold off until the end. So here's a list of some of the documents as a business owner you should consider reviewing while you have time. Go ahead and gather together your lease, your insurance policies. You'll have a variety of them. You might have the business interruption. You might have property insurance. Some people have pollution policies. Go ahead and get those out. Bring out the documents for your various vendors. Everybody from if you have Xerox in your office, if you're ordering materials for something that you assemble, just go ahead and assemble those documents because you're gonna want to look at them. We'll go a little bit over later what you're going to look for, but you're going to want to at least assemble these documents that are probably in a cabinet somewhere. They're on a table that you generally in day-to-day operations you don't have to go over because things just work and they just operate. You set it in motion, and it's not something you have to think about every day. Now you also want to bring out your loan documents, whether you have loans from a bank, or if you have somebody that has equipment leasing. Sometimes people lease their office furniture, things like that. Bring out any employment agreements. Now in Florida, we're an at-will state, which essentially means that people can come and go as they want under ordinary Florida law, and you can terminate employees without a reason. Now, if you have employment agreements, you can change law by contract. So you're going to want to break those out, and we'll go a little more in depth on that later. Go ahead and bring out your financial performance sheets. This is going to be relevant because we're going to go over funding options later on. And if you're considering, the SBA funding, some of the Florida programs or private bank, these are the documents that a lot of them are going to want to see anyways. So go ahead and start generating those reports. I'll tell you, just in my personal experience, I have done quite a few Chapter 11s where you're filing bankruptcy for a company. And one of the common trends that a lot of them have are that they haven't maintained pristine records because a lot of times when you're doing well or you think you're doing well, you don't maintain your records in real time the way that you should, and there has to be some amount of catch up. So now is a good opportunity to go ahead and get out those documents and see when is the last time you've reconciled some of these accounts in QuickBooks? When have you? So go ahead and get that together, because if you're going to look for lending options, they're going to want to see a lot of these documents. Break out your accounts receivable, and then depending on your type of business, you may be licensing your name or a product, or you may have a franchise agreement because you're a franchise and you're going to want to review that. Now we're going to go over your various types of your creditors, your lenders, your traditional banks. Sometimes they give unsecured loans, which means there's not a piece of property that they claim a right to, but otherwise, sometimes there's collateral. There's, it could be all of your equipment. It could be all of your accounts receivable. A lot of times, lenders will just do this catch-all paragraph long list of collateral, whether you have it or not, just so that they are presumably covering everything. And then you're going to want to review, is there a personal guarantee? Is the business owner or some other individual at the business obligated on the loan? Because that may help you assess how you ultimately treat certain creditors. Not everybody outside of, when you're working things out is treated equally. And by reviewing these documents, you're going to have some amount of insight into how you may prioritize certain things. Now let's go to the manufacturers or the franchisors piece. Sometimes people are in these franchise agreements, and the franchise agreement typically provides something along the lines of, if you have, in order to maintain your franchise, you need to operate. You need to have operations going, a usual Monday through Friday or some other time period may be specified in there. And you may have received an executive order or something like that that says, oh, all these non-essential businesses are ordered closed. But you need to consider, are you essential or non-essential? Because right now, everybody is relatively in a state of pause. And I think that we're kind of all addressing a crisis, and people are being a little more collaborative than they ordinarily are. But if you make the determination on your own that you're non-essential and then you don't operate, or you don't find an alternative way to effectively operate, say remote or something like that, that's satisfactory to your franchisor, you may be looking down the road at a point in time where they reach out to you and they say that you breached. Kind of an interesting case out of New Jersey. Car dealerships there reached out to the governor, who had entered an executive order requiring businesses who are not essential to close. And car dealers reached out and they said, based on our franchise or our manufacturers agreements, we need to operate or we could be in violation. And the governor, came out with some level of guidance that said, okay, well, your showroom, not essential, but your service department is essential. And given that sort of direction, they may have some level of cover or defense in the event that a manufacturer takes a position that, well, you should have been operating. So you may want to consider, in some manner, how, when, and you're going to communicate if you have that sort of situation, and kind of recognize that there's not necessarily a clean line that says you're essential or non-essential. It may be service specific, where certain aspects of your business could continue to operate. I don't know if drinking water is violating one of the webinar rules or not, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. It seemed that more people were eating sandwiches and things like that, which I could see being problematic. So now let's go to the landlord's part. I imagine that quite a we've started to experience this in the beginning of March, and in mid-March it really ramped up. But a lot of people don't have their rent payments due until the 1st. I think a lot of landlords just find that easier, particularly those that have many tenants, to go ahead and have a set date in most of their leases. So we're going to see on April 1st how a lot of landlords respond. And this is one of those times where you need to review your lease, evaluate if there's a method to suggest that there should be an abatement of rent, if there's some other excuse, or if there's a way to negotiate here. And this kind of landlords, some amount of them will probably be proactive because they read the news. This isn't a unique problem to one tenant. This is going to be a problem to many tenants. In many cases, they're not under any obligation to revise terms with you, but at the same time, they have to consider their options, where right now, if you want to go to court, it's not particularly fast. Many courts have shut down all operations except essential operations, and they're doing things telephonically to the extent that they're able to. And in some cases, at least in Palm Beach County, the judges themselves are allowed to make determinations. And some have taken the position that they're not going to have hearings for the next month, absent absolute emergencies, which makes the prospect of an eviction or something like that not impossible, but less likely. And that's something to kind of, that landlords will have to grapple with, because you can, let's say you do effectively get somebody out, who's that replacement tenant? But kind of one of the main points here to consider is you're going to have to communicate at some point with each one of these lenders, and you're going to want to put yourself in the best position by having information available to you and a plan available so that you can have that proposal and quick discussion that you're going to need with the landlords, as well as your lenders and other people. We'll go ahead and move a little quickly here over the vendors part. A lot of the same considerations as others. You're going to want to see if there's a way to excuse performance. Oftentimes there is some amount of personal guarantee. I've seen that quite a bit, particularly in the restaurant industry. A lot of the people who provide food will have an owner sign a personal guarantee of some amount. So that's something that you should consider. And additionally, when you're evaluating in a scenario where you don't have the ability to pay everyone and there's timing, you'll have to consider which vendors am I going to need going forward. There's what relationships do I need to maintain, and that may guide you. Now let's discuss employees. This, whether it's I'd say unfortunate, but one of the first areas that people generally look to cut, and we've seen that in massive layoffs across the restaurant industry, as well as some amount in the overall hospitality industry, and are layoffs and terminations of employees. That's one of the fastest ways to address a cash crunch. But I'm sure that all of you can appreciate that once you do recover, the ability to get those employees back, some will understand because we are in this unique time, and other times there may be kind of a permanent loss of that talent. There's some additional considerations. You'll want to go ahead and review the contracts that you have with your employees. Some people enter into a formal engagement agreement or employment agreement where it specifies a number of years that they're going to be employed by the company. They may say that you have to be fired for cause and list very specific cause facts that need to be alleged if you're going to terminate somebody, say they violated a law, or sometimes there's a general performance catch-all, but that's why you'll need to review your contracts and see what specific language your employment agreement contain. Because one of the concerns is if you did enter into one of those agreements and you terminate without complying with the agreement, you may expose the company to a long transfer, something that could have been a short-term problem while fewer people are engaged in commerce, and create a long-term problem for your business because they may seek damages for wrongful termination and things like that. Additionally, as a business owner, things that you want to be careful of and consider, Some owners may have considered, well, my employees understand what's going on, and some may be willing to defer their wages and work during this time. That could potentially expose not only the business, but the individual owner to some level of personal liability under the PLLC for unpaid wage claims and deferral of wages. If somebody's not getting, paid, for instance, either they're not getting paid minimum wage even in that scenario. Additionally, this is a problem that you see whether it's a crisis or not. Occasionally, payroll taxes are not paid the employer side, and that can expose the individual business owner to personal liability as well. Whereas if you kind of are assessing your options now, it may make sense to do short-term layoffs in order to avoid and not deal with that level of personal or long-term company exposure. Right, and we'll see what's ultimately signed off on. I imagine a lot of us were staying up as late as we could, or checked this morning, and it looked like the Senate had passed their version of the CARES Act, and I haven't seen yet if the House has signed off on it yet. But there may be some level of unemployment out there. There will be some level of unemployment out there at the state level, and then likely at the federal level, that will make this less painful for employees. So that may be a consideration to put out there and how to do it legally and as well as humanely. We're going to go briefly over some of those funding your operations now. There are some SBA programs out there. Some business owners may be familiar with SBA loans because they purchased a business or may actively have one now. There are some interesting programs out there, such as the SBA Express Bridge Loan. I believe that provides $25,000 relatively quickly, but it's also going to expect you to have applied for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, because the bridge loan is generally paid back in part by a more permanent loan that you enter into with the SBA. It requires not only that you turn over your business financials, but also your personal financials. These programs are likely worth you applying because they will offer faster funding in some instances, lower interest rates than other instances. But you'll want to really review these loan docs ultimately, because you could end up worse off in some cases than negotiating with your current lending situation. And here's what I mean by that. Generally, you consider your rate, you consider the repayment terms, but you also want to evaluate the collateral as well as the personal exposure that you as a business owner may have to take in under some of this new funding scenarios. You may not have personal guarantees on some of your current loans, but now by accepting some of this different funding or these SBA loans, you may all of a sudden have a personal guarantee. And some people will be comfortable with that and others won't, but it's at least an issue to evaluate. Also, it's not uncommon for the SBA to require collateral. And oftentimes it's not just the business collateral, it may be some of your personal collateral. I've seen SBA loans that require a second mortgage on a homestead. And in Florida, several individuals have made the very robust homestead exemption pretty famous, which now the quick summary on that is, outside of certain creditors, think of your mortgage and people that perform work on your home, generally your homestead is protected from a lot of your other creditors. If you rack up too much credit card debt, for instance, and they get a judgment against you, they're not going to be able to come in and pursue your home as a way of collection. And the SBA oftentimes will require you to put up your home. And again, certain business owners will ultimately decide, my business is worth it. It's my life. You know, Thomas, I hear what you're saying, but this is what I'm going to do. And that's ultimately their decision. But it is something that I want people to be aware of, is some of these are incredible opportunities and you'll want to consider them. And for your individual situation, they may make a lot of sense. But for other people, you could be worse off than negotiating with your current lending situation that may be able to give you some additional breaks. I do want to bring up one kind of interesting loan situation that I encounter quite a bit. Is I notice that people, they're not quite loans, instead they act as accounts receivable purchases. And I have the example here where some, they don't call themselves lenders, but they purchase your accounts receivable. Say, for instance, $100,000 in your future receivables, and they'll loan you $75,000. And over the next 18 months, you're going to pay $100,000 total. They generally want direct access to your merchant account and other bank accounts where they automatically take that out. Now, in Florida, a usurious interest rate is 18%. But if you are purchasing an asset, it doesn't generally look like interest, so you can get much higher. Now, the example I have is $100,000 for 75. I've seen that, but I've also seen, we're going to loan you $50,000 and purchase $100,000 in your receivable, and you need to pay us back in 18 months. And the effective interest rate, if that were a loan, would be much higher than 18%. I do want to bring up some of the proposals that are supposed to be part of the legislation that at least the Senate passed last night. There's these CARES Act loans. They're going to go through your community banks, and there may be an opportunity for loan forgiveness if you retain your employees. So that's another consideration when you're making your employment decisions. Or if you're going to take these loans, sometimes on the front end, they're going to want you to promise or pledge that you're not going to lay off employees. And other ones are going to say, okay, we're going to loan you this money, but if you want to exercise the forgiveness piece, you're going to need to keep people employed. So that's going to be a consideration. Now, for some people, loan forgiveness doesn't matter if you're out of business. If employee, you're still going to have to weigh your personal employee situation. One other point that I wanted to mention on here is the 401k component. I believe the CARES Act is going to look to see it to excuse, some borrowing from retirement accounts, some of the tax penalties, or extend repayment periods without penalty. That's likely included. But one thing to consider is generally those funds are exempt from creditor collection. So putting those into play, you may want to, you're really going to want to evaluate before you do something like that. There's one more. So insurance. There's a lot of discussion out here, and I'm not going to claim to know the answer. One thing that I do know for certain is there's going to be quite a bit of litigation to decide whether certain insurance policies cover what's going on. It's going to largely be policy specific. You're going to want to have your agent as well as some other individual potentially look at your insurance agreements to see what's covered. If it's your business interruption, your property or pollution policy, to see what's covered. And there was some discussion early on that a disease is excluded from some policies, you'll want to look at that. In other instances, we've gone beyond just a disease, but we have government action that may make operating severely eliminated, if not closed altogether. So you're going to want to review that policy. You'll likely have some others review it, and kind of evaluate filing, sending a claim to your insurance company. You'll want to evaluate your policy on how to send it. They could be as specific as you need to mail it to this address, you need to email this person. Just some things to consider when you're reviewing your insurance options. Now we're going to go to court operations. Because, for instance, some of you may be sitting on AR collections at this point in time, because initially a lot of this presentation discusses you as the borrower, but many of you are now creditors. Maybe customers have slowed payment. Some of them may have already been 60 to 90 days, and you're kind of weighing your options. So you have your traditional demand letters and things like that you send out, and then they inevitably end with, and if you don't pay up by this date, then a lawsuit will be filed or something along those lines. But given our current situation right now, I wanted to explain a little bit about what's going on in the court system, so that you have some level of idea of what those options look like, whether you're which side of the equation you're on, as the debtor or the creditor. What's kind of interesting right now is bankruptcy filings generally have been down during this moment in time. And that may be kind of counterintuitive, because you have this big interruption event, and a lot of people are struggling. But law firms, a lot of them had to transition to remote quickly, and they hadn't all necessarily gotten those capabilities in place. And additionally, the courts hadn't given a lot of guidance early on as far as how things would be approached. At this point, the Southern District of Florida's bankruptcy courts, which extend all the way from the Keys up to Martin County, they've expanded their telephonic capabilities. They're still having daily appearances. Now, the exception for that is our trials and evidentiary hearings. Sometimes cases require extensive documents, sometimes they don't. If they require extensive documents, it doesn't lend itself to telephonic. So a lot of those are being canceled either by agreement or by the courts themselves. In state court, we have kind of general guidance from the Florida Supreme Court, but they've also given a lot of latitude to each individual county. And the counties themselves are then going even a step further, and some are giving blanket orders, and others are allowing judge by judge. For instance, in Palm Beach County, they said that only essential court operations will go forward, except if your judge determines that it can effectively go forward without people personally appearing. Now, a lot of hearings are being canceled, and some judges are taking the view of, well, I'm not going to operate, or I'm not going to conduct hearings for a month. So there's this kind of case-by-case situation. So whether you're a plaintiff or a defendant, people generally don't think courts move particularly quick. Right now, it's even slower. One thing that's kind of going out there are eviction moratoriums. Certain states have put them in, Florida hasn't. These eviction moratoriums generally focus on residential. For instance, Broward entered an eviction moratorium. But the way that practically works in a lot of situations isn't that the eviction case isn't being filed, although in some cases it's not even being filed depending on your county. But instead, what's going on is if you have an active eviction now, where the only step that remained was to have the sheriff come and have the person removed and the property removed, they've requested that the sheriffs, at least in Broward, not go forward with those evictions. It's likely that we're going to see that more and more. Generally, as I said, those are more residential moratoriums and not so much on commercial property. So it'll be interesting to see how that piece of it proceeds. We don't have guidance at this point. Here's, you may have, one of the first slides describes me as a restructuring attorney. A lot of people generally don't understand what that means, but it's that broad term for different ways to modify your debts. Some people think of what they do as a puzzle. I think of it more as a puzzle as well as Jenga, because you have so many different pieces that you're trying to put together. But if one piece doesn't click, then that can be the part that has the tower collapse. You have your different options. You have your out-of-court workouts. That's traditionally when you or your attorney or some other representative is reaching out to each creditor and kind of negotiating, with your lease financing. They're negotiating with landlords. They're negotiating with banks to try to either get payoff terms or get things paid, deferrals, and kind of push payment dates out, which some amount of lenders are willing to do now. Then there are those instances where you need a court proceeding, and the benefit of a court proceeding is it brings all of those creditors to one forum, so that you're not dealing with them each outside of the process. You have your Chapter 7s, that's the common liquidation, where all aspects are sold, the creditors kind of get what they get, and the piece with that is that your business kind of ceases operating with you, and a bankruptcy trustee takes over. In a Chapter 11, by comparison, the company generally remains in control, and they are continuing to negotiate with each one of their individual creditors, but they also sometimes are litigating. Powers that you have in Chapter 11 are, even without the agreement of some of your lenders, in the right circumstances, you can force a court to modify the terms of the loan, either extend payment terms out, reduce interest rates, reduce security. So that's, we think of the big ones such as like a GM or Pier 1 or something like that. And both Chapter 7 and Chapter 11 take place in federal court. In Florida, we have what's called an assignment for the benefit of creditors. It's kind of like a Chapter 11, except it takes place in state court. You have you select a person that takes over the business and acts as a liquidator. So you have some level of control, at least initially, on who that person's going to be. And they, may sell the whole business to somebody new. Sometimes old ownership buys it out with new investors, and they move forward, or sometimes it's just pieces of the business that are sold. And that's my presentation. Open up if we have any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Just a reminder, if you hit the chat button at the bottom, you can direct your question to myself or Thomas. Well, that's okay. Sometimes I know my questions don't come until later after the presentation. So just so everyone knows, all of this is being recorded. We're going to send out an email. So if you do have questions that come up later, you can always email me back. We'll also have Thomas's information, so you can email him directly with any of your questions.
Yeah. And
Thomas, anything you want to say at the end?
So what I would like to say right now is, I'm getting quite a few calls, and people are definitely concerned out of the gates. But in many instances, you don't need to act same day or the next day. You do have a period of time, and that's kind of what I'm promoting here is, take this time for reflection on your business, and not necessarily to make an impulsive or urgent or fearful act. Hey, you're smart people that got into business, have done well, care about your business and your employees, and this situation is not unique to you. Some people are very upset at the prospect of not being able to pay everyone because they always have. Their parents taught them that they always should. And that's very difficult for people to deal with mentally. But like I said, this is not unique to you. This is a widespread crisis. And you do have, and it's easy to feel helpless, but you do have a lot of power here to kind of take control and reflect. And for some people, this is going to be a great turning point for them. And they're going to, business is going to be better than ever because they're going to figure out something new. And for others, I've encountered, some who are viewing this as an opportunity to move on and do something different. But they kind of go ahead and take this time to evaluate your options. You're not going to get this much time at home again when we return to normal. So go ahead and take advantage of some of the peace.
Good. Well, thank you so much. Just so everyone knows, again, this presentation will be recorded and sent to everyone. Sarah, anything you wanted to add?
I just want to thank you, Thomas, and thank you for the last words that you said, especially because we are not alone. And it's very true. We were raised to pay our bills and, but you kind of put in perspective where we're all at in the world right now, not just Florida. So, and appreciate as at the chamber, we've had a lot of members reaching out and asking for, questions about evictions and their lease and things like that. So you clarified a lot of things for me. And certainly, we will refer people to reach out to you if they have legal questions. But thank you all for coming. Thanks for spending the morning with us. And I guess we'll see you tonight, right, Sophia?
Yep, we have our virtual happy hour at 5:30 tonight. I will send the link to everyone to join. It should be really cool and fun. It's BYOB, of course, so bring your own drinks, bring your dogs, your kids, and the camera. We'll have a lot of fun. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.